Imagine looking at a country where families are gathering at grave sites, but instead of weeping, they're clapping.
Yeah, it's a completely jarring image if you're used to traditional mourning.
Right. I mean, they're performing ancient war dances and they're cheering. Usually, a funeral is like the ultimate space of quiet submission. But what you are seeing here, however, is a deeply profound act of defiance. And today, we are exploring exactly why this is happening.
It really it forces us to completely reevaluate the social mechanics of grief. It's turning what is traditionally an act of mourning into this highly calculated political strategy.
Definitely. And to understand how a society even reaches that point, we are taking a deep dive into the psychological evolution of political instability in contemporary Iran.
And we've got some incredible source material to go through for this.
We do. Our sources for you today range from academic cognitive linguistic studies and World Bank economic data, all the way to think tank analyses and on-the-ground reports from the crises of 2025 and early 2026.
Yeah, the material we're synthesizing here maps out this really complex intersection of economics, digital infrastructure, and, well, human behavior.
Exactly. So our mission for you today is to unpack how decades of systemic pressure, economic decline, and digital isolation have fundamentally rewired the collective psychology of an entire nation. We're looking at this massive transformation from passive hopelessness into just, unprecedented defiance.
But before we dive into those mechanics, though, we really must explicitly address you, the listener, regarding the nature of these sources.
Yes, very important point. The materials we're discussing contain highly politically charged content regarding the Iranian government, international conflicts, and domestic protests.
Right, and we must make it absolutely clear that we are never taking any sides here.
Yeah.
We're not endorsing the viewpoints, the actions, or the policies of the regime, the protesters, or any foreign entities mentioned.
Not at all. We are simply and impartially conveying the ideas, theories, and events exactly as they are documented in the original source material. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand the current rebellion, the dancing at the grave sites, we have to understand the psychological baseline created by 50 years of history leading up to this moment.
Yeah, and measuring a nation's psychological baseline, that requires looking at the architecture of their communication.
Which brings us to that linguistic study, right?
Exactly. There's this fascinating study in our sources by two academics, Meshkin Pham and Nazgai Kohan, focusing entirely on the Persian language.
And they looked at a huge time frame, didn't they?
They did. They analyzed movies, novels, news broadcasts, and official speeches over 5 decades. So from the 1970s all the way through the 2010s, specifically tracking the linguistic markers for hopefulness and hopelessness.
And what stands out in their findings, at least to me, isn't just that hopelessness increased across those 50 years. We might expect that, but it's rather how the language itself defines the concept.
Right. It's the cognitive model itself. According to their research, Iranians linguistically conceptualize hopelessness as an inability.
Wait, so it's not just a feeling of sadness?
No, not at all. It is encoded as a profound lack of agency. It's a structural paralysis rather than just, a fleeting emotion.
Wow.
And we actually see the inverse with how hopefulness is constructed. In their language patterns, hopefulness is viewed as an external object or a reliance on another entity.
So hope isn't something you generate from within.
Right. It's an external resource that you either possess or someone else has to bring it to you.
Man, that feels like societal learned helplessness. If you're living in a system where you feel you have zero control, the very language you speak begins to frame your reality as one of total inability.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
So systemic poverty in this context isn't just an economic state, is it? It functions as a psychological cage that's intentionally built to restrict the population's sense of agency.
Absolutely. And if we connect this linguistic idea to the bigger picture, specifically this sociological theory called relative deprivation, the whole mechanism becomes clear.
Break that down for us. What is relative deprivation?
Well, it occurs when there is a severe widening gap between what a population expects their standard of living to be and the actual reality they have to endure on a daily basis.
The friction between expectation and reality.
Exactly. That friction is what generates collective despair.
And looking at the structural indicators from the BTI 2024 report in our sources, that friction is immense.
That's staggering.
Yeah, by early 2023, official inflation hovered around 50%, and absolute poverty literally doubled to 30% between 2017 and 2019.
And it gets worse when you look at the food security data.
Right. Further compounding this, there was a 2024 announcement by the Ministry of Social Welfare stating that 57% of Iranians suffer from malnourishment.
So when you take that level of severe economic deprivation and you feed it into a linguistic and cultural framework where hopelessness literally translates to an inability to act.
You forge a society that feels deeply paralyzed.
Exactly. The baseline becomes this deeply entrenched inertia.
But I have to push back on the timeline here, though.
Okay, sure.
Because if the baseline is deep hopelessness and a total linguistic inability to act, how did Iran transition from that paralysis to the massive fieldless protests we saw in the mid-2020s? I mean, population doesn't just wake up one morning and shed 50 years of learned helplessness.
No, you're entirely right, they don't. And the shift didn't happen to the entire population simultaneously. The rupture actually occurred within a specific demographic that completely broke the psychological mold.
We're talking about Iran's Generation Z.
Yes, locally known as Dahe Hashtadi, or the 80s generation in the Iranian calendar. These are individuals born roughly between 1997 and 2010.
How big is that group?
They make up about 7% of population, which translates to roughly 6 million people.
Okay, but a lot of this sounds like, standard generational friction. Globally, Gen Z is often cited as politically disillusioned or apathetic. I mean, they vote less in many Western democracies.
Like, that's the global trend.
So why does this particular cohort in Iran suddenly become the vanguard of a highly dangerous political movement instead of just retreating into apathy?
Well, the difference lies in the extreme pressure cooker of their economic reality, combined with this phenomenon called preference falsification.
Okay, let's look at the data first.
Right. So economically, 77% of Iranians aged 15 to 24 are NEET. That means not in education, employment, or training.
77%? Wow.
Yeah. You have millions of young people with zero economic mobility. And then you have preference falsification, which is the theory that under authoritarian regimes, citizens hide their true political preferences and conform publicly just to avoid punishment.
It's like a dam holding back water. On the surface, the water looks calm, but the structural pressure is building exponentially beneath the waterline.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism. The dam holds until a specific catalyst creates a crack.
And what was the crack for the Dahi Hashtadi?
For them, that catalyst was a massive, unintentional structural error by the state during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, the internet access.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To facilitate distance learning during the lockdowns, the regime was forced to provide high-speed internet access to broad segments of the population that previously had very limited connectivity.
So the state essentially handed a digitally native generation the exact tools they needed to bypass internal state media.
Yes, they did.
And I'd argue it didn't just give these kids new information, it actually provided them with an entirely different psychological baseline of what a normal life looks like compared to what their parents experience.
That's a crucial point. This generation grew up exposed to global digital culture. They do not share the ideological idealizations of the 1979 revolution at all.
They're looking outside the bubble.
Right. Because their baseline for normalcy was calibrated by the global internet rather than state television, they're largely neutral on state religious ideologies. And they are entirely fearless in their political expression.
Which we see manifested in their aggressive boycotting of elections.
Yeah. And their willingness to openly target symbols of the regime, completely disregarding the red lines that paralyzed previous generations.
But the regime obviously recognized that the internet had broken their psychological monopoly, right? They had to know.
Oh, they definitely knew. But they couldn't just confiscate millions of smartphones.
Right.
So instead, they had to engineer a way to reclaim that digital space.
And this is where they pivoted to building the National Information Network, or the NIN, which the sources often refer to as a digital iron curtain.
Yes. But we really need to understand how it functions mechanically. It was built heavily with infrastructure from Chinese tech firms. And the NIN is essentially a massive domestic internet.
So it's closed off.
Completely. It allows the state to sever the country's connection to the global internet, cutting off platforms like WhatsApp or Instagram while keeping their domestic banking, hospitals, and internal communications running.
That's incredibly strategic. They built a kill switch that isolates the population from the world without crashing their own domestic economy in the process.
Exactly. And the physical reality that occurs behind that digital blackout is severe.
Yeah, the sources cite some deeply disturbing numbers here. During prolonged internet shutdowns, there are reports of massive casualties, with figures suggesting up to 30,000 people were killed by security forces in the ensuing media vacuum.
It's horrific. But the regime's strategy actually evolved beyond just mere censorship.
How so?
Well, the state realized that simply turning off the internet signals weakness. It breeds resentment, which raises an important question about modern psychological warfare. How do you control a digitally native population when you can't just unplug them forever?
You weaponize the content itself.
Precisely.
During the 12-day Iran-Israel war in June 2025, the sources note the regime deployed a tactic called content flooding.
Right. Instead of just blocking information about the conflict, the state flooded both the NIN and global social media platforms with AI-generated synthetic videos.
Like the fighter jet videos.
Exactly. They fabricated high-fidelity images of Israeli F-35 fighter jets being shot down over Iranian territory. And they synthesized massive videos of pro-Israel protests taking place in Tehran to falsely suggest the public was turning against the state.
Which creates deliberate confusion among actual opposition groups.
That's the entire point.
It's literally like gaslighting an entire nation. The goal of content flooding isn't necessarily to make the public believe a specific lie, is it?
No, it's not about selling one lie.
Right. If you blast fake victories and confusing narratives across state television and social media simultaneously, you degrade the population's cognitive ability to discern what's actually happening. It induces a state of complete epistemological collapse.
That's a great way to describe it.
I mean, if a citizen cannot trust a video of a protest they see on their phone, how can they possibly coordinate a resistance movement?
They can't. It forces a retreat from the digital sphere entirely. When your digital reality is constantly manipulated or blacked out, the internet is no longer a viable space for mobilization.
So where do they go?
The population naturally migrates to the one environment the state cannot fully synthesize.
Right.
Physical, cultural spaces. Specifically, the ancient rituals of mourning.
Which brings us back to the beginning of our deep dive. The clapping and the dancing at the grave sites.
Yeah.
The physical cemetery becomes the new town square.
Exactly. But the state understands the power of these physical spaces just as well as the opposition does.
Naturally.
So the regime employs a counter-strategy that political analysts in our sources call the funeral trap. And this was deployed on a massive scale following the assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei.
Let's examine the mechanics of this trap because it's fascinating. Following the assassination, the state declared 40 days of official national mourning. And that isn't just an arbitrary number, is it?
No, not at all. It leans heavily on the Karbala paradigm, which is the foundational narrative of Shia identity.
Right.
The Karbala paradigm is deeply embedded in the culture. It's a historical framework that turns assassination into martyrdom, and it utilizes collective grief as an engine for mass mobilization.
So by declaring 40 days of mourning, the regime monopolizes the physical streets.
Yes. They absorbed the social shock of the assassination by flooding the public squares with grief-charged supporters.
And mechanically, this traps the opposition, because if the revolutionaries attempt to stage anti-government protests during a sacred 40-day mourning period, they risk alienating the broader public by appearing to desecrate a deeply religious event.
Right. The state effectively uses the architecture of traditional grief as a shield against political upheaval.
But this is where the Dahi Hashtati Gen Z and the grieving families introduce a profound subversion.
Yeah, they refuse to play by the rules of the funeral trap.
We see this in the ceremonies for slain protesters, right? Like 23-year-old student Raha Balolipur, she posted, "Woman, life, freedom forever," just before she was killed in Tehran.
Yes, her case and also Mani Safarpour.
Right. At the 40th day ceremonies for these individuals, their families actively dismantled the solemn state-approved religious rites. They gathered in cemeteries and literally replaced weeping with clapping.
It's an incredible shift.
They performed the droom, which is this ancient tribal war dance, and they completely rejected the state-coined word for martyr, shahid.
Right. Instead, they utilized the term javidnam, which means eternal names.
By stripping away the state's vocabulary of mourning, they basically neutralized the state's ability to co-opt their grief.
Exactly.
It's amazing. If the state entirely monopolizes the language and structure of traditional grief, dancing literally becomes the only vocabulary left for survival and protest.
It is an incredible adaptation. However, living in a constant state of adaptation takes a massive toll. This high-stakes battle over digital reality, economic survival, and the right to mourn it has profound psychological consequences on the population.
What do the sources say about that toll?
They outline a really severe clinical diagnosis for this society. Iran is experiencing what psychologists term A nationwide psychological rupture.
A rupture.
Yes. We're looking at a collective nervous system collapse. The citizenry is described as living with a constant hum of fear. It's a state of chronic hypervigilance, characterized by fragmented sleep and a perpetual anticipation of the next crisis.
And this trauma is not just confined within the borders of Iran either.
No, not at all.
The diaspora, Iranians living abroad, they experience externalized collective trauma. They're forced to watch their homeland destabilize through a throttled, AI-manipulated internet feed.
Which is agonizing.
They suffer from intense survivor's guilt, physically safe but psychologically tethered to the danger their families face every single day.
And this complex web of trauma significantly impacts the political calculus of the population as well. It leads to a phenomenon analysts identify as the fear of collapse.
Now, this is a crucial point, and it directly contradicts a frequent Western assumption. Often, observers from the outside look at an oppressed population and wonder, why don't they simply trigger a total explosive revolution to overthrow the government immediately?
Right. It seems so simple from the outside.
But the Iranian dilemma is much more complex. It's like choosing between staying in a burning room or jumping out of a 10-story window.
That is the exact dilemma. Many Iranians, even those who vehemently oppose the regime, hesitate to fully support immediate regime change or foreign military intervention.
Because they look across the region, right?
Exactly. They look at the aftermath of revolutions in Syria and Libya. The structural devastation in those nations serves as a terrifying precedent.
Right. When a population's nervous system is already completely exhausted by trauma, the prospect of an unknown violent civil war is paralyzing.
Yeah. And as the sources note, many find themselves trapped in this tragic compromise. They often prefer an unsatisfying stability over the total chaos of state collapse.
So the fear of what replaces the regime becomes almost as paralyzing as the regime itself.
Precisely.
Well, let's synthesize the journey we've mapped out for you today. We began by examining how 50 years of systemic economic pressure literally rewired the Persian language, establishing a psychological baseline where hopelessness is defined as an absolute inability to act.
Right. And then we tracked how demographic realities collided with the pandemic.
Yeah.
You had a massive generation of unemployed youth, unintentionally handed global internet access, who then bypassed state ideology and shattered that baseline of fear.
Which then forced the state into deploying a digital intranet and AI-generated content flooding to disorient the public, which in turn pushed the battleground back into the physical world.
Yeah, the state attempted to trap the population within the religious architecture of mourning.
And the population responded by subverting that architecture, weaponizing their grief into war dances at gravesites.
Every single step is an escalation in a battle for the collective psychology of the nation.
And that is exactly why this deep dive matters for you. It illustrates that political instability is not merely a spreadsheet of GDP contraction. It's not a timeline of international sanctions or a map of military drone strikes. At its core, instability is fundamentally about the breaking and remaking of the human mind on a mass scale.
Yeah, understanding the geopolitical landscape really requires understanding the psychological endurance of the people living within it.
Absolutely. As we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder on your own. We've detailed how Generation Z has been rewired for absolute defiance, utilizing the internet to break decades of learned helplessness. But if they do ultimately succeed in fundamentally changing the nation, how does trauma inherit? Can a generation whose entire nervous system was developed under a constant hum of fear and hypervigilance ever successfully build trusting, stable democratic institutions? Or does the psychological rupture of the revolution outlast the revolution itself?
It's a heavy question.
Yeah.
It really asks us to consider if the act of surviving the fire permanently alters your ability to build the house that comes after.
Very well said. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. Keep questioning the world around you, and the next time you witness a seemingly simple act like clapping at a funeral, ask yourself what invisible psychological battles are being fought just beneath the surface.